President Trump is facing widespread condemnation for his handling of the unrest in dozens of American cities. It follows the killing of George Floyd, an African-American who died last week in Minneapolis while being detained by police. His death has now been declared a homicide following an official post-mortem. On the streets of some cities, there's been more violence and looting, prompting Mr. Trump to say that he will send in the military. The president's Democratic rival for the White House, Joe Biden, accused Mr. Trump of using racist language and of failing in his presidential duty to unite the nation. For the latest, let's join our correspondent Ali Makboul in Washington.
Well, hundreds of people outside the White House again this evening, right now with their hands up, with the hands up, don't shoot chant that they've been chanting over recent nights. But at the same time, over the last hour, what we've been seeing is huge convoys of military personnel fanning out across this city. And Donald Trump has promised an even tougher response on people on the streets tonight. That's when he's already receiving heavy criticism for coming down hard on legal, peaceful protesters.
Lock him up! Lock him up!
Undeterred, they're outside the White House again. But the focus of their anger now is not just violent police officers who kill unarmed black men, but the president as well.
It's terrible that people can't protest, which, by the way, is their First Amendment right. President Trump likes to talk a lot about the Second Amendment, owning guns and everything, but won't even comment when we come to do what we are literally raised to do, born to do as Americans.
Donald Trump himself has appeared quite pleased with the way he has, in his words, dominated with overwhelming force. But those subjected to that force here late yesterday were peaceful protesters out in the memory of George Floyd.
As we speak, I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers.
And with that, demonstrators were gassed and shoved and pushed back from the historic church outside which they'd been protesting, though it was well before any curfew.
I feel like I'm not even feeling 1/8 of what black people feel every single day, and I'm terrified.
And what was it all for, particularly outside the church? Well, this. The president took a short walk to St. John's to show he's in control and apparently to pose with a Bible. Donald Trump's Democratic presidential rival has been critical of his handling of this crisis.
The country is crying out for leadership. Leadership that can unite us, leadership that brings us together, leadership that can recognize pain and deep grief of communities that have had a knee on their neck for a long time.
But the security forces continue to force back demonstrators on the orders of a president who's claimed to be a champion of free speech. But there's a sense that this will go on.
We've been Martin Luther King for ages, for generations on end. It's time for Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey. Like, no justice, no peace. Like, that's not just a mantra anymore. That's about to be a way of life.
Although the military and the police have fairly successfully shut down a lot of zones across the American capital, there are still large pockets of protest traveling throughout the city, determined to continue to demonstrate.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
The president may have disrupted the protests in Washington and with it dealt with some of the looting, but his critics feel his actions compared to those of authoritarian leaders around the world the US would previously have condemned. Ali Makboul, BBC News in Washington.
Well, within the past hour, the family of George Floyd took part in a march in his home city of Houston, Texas. And there have been protests across the United States, including in Minneapolis. That was the city where Mr. Floyd was killed. Our correspondent Barbara Pletasher is there with the latest.
Yes, there have been a number of protests here today, Hugh, including one that involved faith leaders who marched right up to this memorial site. The situation has largely stabilized, though, but attention is still very much focused on accountability. One of the officers was charged, and the Attorney General is saying that prosecutors are working as quickly as they can to see whether the other 3 who were involved in the arrest should be charged as well. But the unrest that began here is still rolling across the country.
Minneapolis is reclaiming the place that sent the city into spasms of anger and unrest. Smothering with flowers the spot where George Floyd stopped breathing, pinned down by a police officer's knee on his neck. It's become a pilgrimage site for those demanding justice for George.
Black lives! Black lives!
At the state capitol, a sit-in echoing the civil rights movement. 60 years later, still demanding equal justice for African Americans, especially an end to police brutality against black people. The Minnesota government has announced it will investigate the conduct of the state's largest police department, stretching back 10 years. In Houston, Texas, it seemed like the whole city had turned out to march for Mr. Floyd. Members of his family joined them. This is where he grew up and where he'll be buried. Packed streets in New York City, emptied out in recent months to contain the coronavirus pandemic, now full once again with protesters. The anger has taken a destructive turn here, as it has elsewhere.
I mean, unfortunately, there are people out here looting, but you can't tell angry people how they can be angry. You know, that's like telling the slaves not to burn down Master's house.
But this looked like more than protest about racial injustice. In Manhattan, bands of young people dressed mostly in black took advantage of the unrest to pillage stores that had been shuttered because of the coronavirus. Police struggled to respond, and the mayor imposed a curfew, a double quarantine. The vast majority of protests are peaceful, but it doesn't take much for the mood to change. Police have been responding with more and more force. And they have been attacked. In several cities last night, 4 were shot and injured in St. Louis.
Some coward fired shots at officers, and now we have 4 in the hospital. But thankfully, and thank God, they're alive. They're alive. But can we make some sense out of this? Can we make some sense out of this?
Take a knee!
Police are struggling to make sense of their role, to restore law and order, but also respond to the tragedy of Minneapolis.
We're appalled at what happened in Minneapolis. Period. But we gotta do better.
In that city, faith leaders made clear they were siding with those calling for justice. People are demanding that all of the officers involved in Mr. Floyd's arrest be charged. Accountability in this case might be the beginning of an answer, but only the beginning. Barbara Platt-Usher, BBC News, Minneapolis.
Also today, artists and record labels and radio stations suspended business on what's been called Blackout Tuesday in response to the killing of George Floyd. Celebrities and social media users across the world joined them in solidarity to show their support for the black community. And the Oscar-winning film director Spike Lee has long been an outspoken critic of police brutality and racism suffered by America's black community. He said scenes witnessed in the United States over the past week were not new and had been going on in various ways since the advent of slavery in America 4 centuries ago. Spike Lee was speaking to Will Gompertz ahead of the release of his latest film.
Black GI, is it fair to serve more than the white Americans that sent you here?
In the broad sense, is the Vietnam War through the viewpoint of black Vietnam vets.
I see ghosts.
What happens to all of us, man?
You are more than a filmmaker. You're an intellectual, you're an activist, and you are very eloquent on the situation of racism. How do you bring about change?
We have to talk about how the United States of America was founded, the foundation. The foundation of this country is immoral. The land was stolen from the native people. Genocide was committed against the native people. And my ancestors were stolen from Africa, brought here to work. So the foundation of the United States of America is genocide, stealing the land, and slavery. And so any architect will tell you that if you don't have a strong foundation, the building's gonna be shaky. And it's been shaky from day one.
The whole music business has come out in solidarity for George Floyd.
Right.
This seems to have resonated beyond America.
Yes, and I think that's a good point. I'm glad you bring it up, because the United States of America, racism, they do it better than anybody else. But it's not just racism is all over the world. This is a global pandemic before Corona.
We've been dying for this country from the very get-go.
I shall resign the presidency.
What did you think of President Trump's suggestion that he'd put military on the streets if the protests didn't cease?
Well, I was watching this last night with my family, and we were all screaming in disbelief that this thing was staged. The show of force, gassing innocent, peaceful bystanders so you could clear the street. He's a gangster. You know, he's trying to be, he's a dictator.
Mookie, they killed him. They killed Radio Raheem. Murder. They did it again, just like Michael Stewart. Murder. Eleanor
But if you're talking about the young Spike Lee, young filmmaker, disraised, angry, does that apply to Spike Lee today?
Let's take a step behind that. Why are people angry? People are angry because Black people are being killed left and right. Cops walk away free. If they're angry for a reason. You're angry because you live every day in this world where the system is not set up for you to win.
And that was the director Spike Lee talking to Will Gompertz. Now with me in the studio is our North America editor, John Sopel. John, let's take stock on where we are. And do you think we've now reached the position where it's impossible to separate what's going on in the US from the politics of this year?
Yeah, you'd think it was grave enough that politics wouldn't intrude, but they have. Light bulb moment for me yesterday morning. Donald Trump tweeting after the night of terrible rioting across America how good his poll numbers were. This evening, in the last hour, he's tweeted about sleepy Joe Biden again, saying he thinks he knows the answers. He doesn't even know the questions. And that, of course, follows Joe Biden breaking cover, coming out from the basement where he's been for the past 3 months and taking off his face mask and launching a scathing attack on Donald Trump for his handling of the race riots that we're seeing across America. Now, Donald Trump doesn't want to back down. He wants to say, look, I am the guy who is going to bring law and order back to the streets. That is going to be his pitch. I think it's notable how few Republicans have come out and backed what happened yesterday when he went to that church and held up a Bible, leading to thousands of peaceful demonstrators being tear-gassed in the process. Republican senators have been stopped and asked for their reaction. One prominent supporter of the president said, oh, is that what happened? I didn't actually see it. No one can say in November there won't be a clear choice between Donald Trump, Mr. Law and Order, Mr. Tough Guy, and Joe Biden, Mr. Unity, Mr. Empathy. The only thing I think they have in common is that both of them are in their 70s.
John, many thanks once again. John Sopel there for us, our North America editor.